Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Ellingwood, and I'm the General Manager of the Ontario Forage Council. Welcome to the first of 3 webinars in our 2024 Profitable Pastures series. Thank you to our conference sponsors, Beef Farmers of Ontario and Farmers for Climate Solutions, more specifically the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program, and to tonight's speaker sponsor, Ontario Sheep Farmers. Tonight's presenter is Joe Dickenson. Joe is a birth-to-beef farmer in Lambton County. He grew up on a dairy and beef farm on the edge of Sarnia, but expanded and moved the beef herd to Oil Springs in 2008. Since moving to Oil Springs, he has constantly adjusted his farming methods to improve the productivity on his farm and allow him to better utilize his land base. He has been a feedlot director of the Beef Farmers of Ontario since 2020 and has been a sessional professor at Lambton College since September of 2021 and University of Guelph Ridgetown campus since October 2022. Joe, his wife Sonia, and their daughter Odette live in Don Euphemia Township. Thank you for coming and welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Patricia. The topic's going to be getting started on rotational grazing. As we know, there's a lot of emphasis on rotational grazing and how we can make improvements to it. And I know sometimes we kind of get the cart ahead of the horse here, and people know that the programs are out there, they know that the options are out there, but they don't necessarily know what we're talking about when we talk about rotational grazing. And that startup process can be a little bit daunting for people. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about some grazing types. I'm going to talk to you about my path as well, because my path actually does touch on a few different types of rotational grazing and how we've made these progressive steps as time has gone on. We're going to talk about some of the tools of the trade as well, and we're going to follow up at the very end with some lessons learned and then some Q&A. So first off, these are my cows. This is kind of continuous grazing, but when we talk about continuous grazing normally, that's that standard, okay, we've got the pasture, we're going to kick the cows out or kick the sheep out or whatever in May, and we'll see them in September. We don't necessarily do a lot of additional work on moving them. We let them do that job themselves. And basically the pasture stays the same in terms of dimensions from day one to the final day of grazing. In the photo in front of you, what's going on actually is the cattle are eating some cover crops after a wheat field. And basically we turn them in kind of at the end of the cycle. You can see the hawthorns are turning there, and they're just helping to clean up some of that top growth going into the winter. So continuous grazing, it's a pretty simple system. It's pretty non-labor intensive. You're still going to want to check your perimeter pastures because you don't want your perimeter fences because you don't really want escapees. But beyond that, you're not moving fences on the inside. So in that sense, it's relatively non-labor intensive. Your stocking density is really important though. In the spring and early summer is going to be when you have your maximum growth of grasses. So if you can, what you want to do is have as many animals as possible on that pasture at the start, and then slowly start to pull them off as the production of the pasture goes down. You also want to maybe ask yourself, is this a pasture or is it an exercise yard? Just being honest with yourself. Are you expecting these animals to get nutrition off of this? Or are you giving them the same feed that they would if they were inside? They just happen to be going outside to cut down on some barn work, keep the manure outside, etc. There have been some research done where there is potential for decent gains. But if you're looking at decent gains for continuous grazing, that's when the management really steps up, because you have to match your pasture with your stocking density. You have to be very careful, because what happens when you're turning animals into a continuous grazing operation, it's like kids at the buffet. And any of us have done it. We've gone to the buffet restaurant and we've looked and we've said, all right, I can eat anything here. Why would I go eat salad? The dessert table's there and we're just going to keep going back to it. And that's exactly what happens here. The animals are going to find the most palatable feed and they're just going to keep going back to it constantly. And what ends up happening is they actually kill off those more palatable grasses, and the feed that isn't as palatable starts to overcome that pasture. Now, if we're talking about rotational grazing, things are going to be a little bit different, because we're going to put in a lot of preemptive management to overcome the kids at the buffet problem. Now, this is a video of my cows here. We're actually moving them from one strip to another. The field that they're going into, again, is actually a fairly large field. I don't like to have them in this big an area during the growing period, but we had to do that there simply because that was where they were coming from the pasture onto the new strip. There wasn't a lot of feed there, so we were able to kind of take advantage of that. If we had water near the back, we could have just kept that a smaller area and moved them along. So there's a few different approaches here to rotational grazing. It's going to be more management intensive, but it's going to make your land and resource use a lot more efficient. So we can talk about cell or paddock grazing first. And this is kind of, I find that midpoint between really intensive management and continuous grazing. And the cell grazing kind of fits in the middle here. So if we look at this picture on the right, we can see the 1-day cell, the 4-day cell, the 2-day cell, etc. What happens is you've broken your pasture, in this case, into 5 different cells. And each one of those cells has a certain amount of time that you can have the animals in. When they finish that cell, they're going to move into the next one. And you're going to build that rotation. The upside to having a system like this is once you get it planned out, it's just making sure that the fences work, making sure the animals are getting moved when they need to get moved, making adjustments where you may need to. Maybe you need to cut that 2-day cell down to 1-day cell when you go back through for another rotation. And what's going on there is you're giving a rest period for those cells that the animals have moved off of. Now, if you look over to the left, this is actually my first pasture that I had full control over. When we started off, this was a 35-acre pasture, and it actually had 5 strips. The other one is on the far left side against the lot line and on the other side of the creek. What would happen, we had a water station in section 1, and we had a laneway running up along the front of sections 2, 3, and 4. What we tried to do was we tried to have the animals in each one of those strips for about a week. That way, when we did that, that gave a rest period of about a month for every section except section 1. Section 1, we didn't quite have that luxury because we had the water tank. Later on, we did put a fence in right in line with the laneway. So we could give section 1 a rest, and we went with that approach. Now, when we started, we had about 25 animals on this pasture, and those 25 animals were eating the 35 acres starting in May and ending in September. As we started increasing the management on that property, by the end we had about 50 head on that same land base. So what ended up happening was we were able to get a little bit more production out of that land. There were some times when we grew some crops in a couple of these sections, and then we'd come back and eat the crop residue or cover crops or that sort of thing as well. But at the very end, it was strictly grass. So what cell grazing does, you're breaking the pasture into smaller chunks. It's going to allow for regrowth. You want to plan your cells so that you have as much regrowth as possible, and you can utilize other methods to maximize the pasture from there. As I said, it's the midpoint between continuous grazing and intensive grazing. And ideally, you want to keep the animals on that for no more than 5 days. If you can get it shorter, that's even better, because that's when that grass is going to start regrowing. And that's when it tastes really good. So the cattle are going to start going back to it. So if we can get the animals off before it starts regrowing, that's perfect. But there are places where cell grazing can work even if you're having more of an intensive system. In this case, this is at my current farm, and we have a couple bush lots in our pasture. Because of that, when it gets incredibly hot, we can turn the animals into there. It takes the heat off the cows and makes it a lot more comfortable for them. We're still going to only keep them in there for 3 to 4 days, but it at least gives them a break from the heat. Now, strip grazing is a little bit different again. We're going to break the cells up further. Ideally, we're going to keep the animals in for a day or less. It's going to be extremely dynamic, because as you're running the animals through, if your growth isn't keeping up with the animals, you can make those strips bigger, or maybe you do an extra move. You can make a few different adjustments as needed accordingly. So this is an example of a strip grazing system. In this case, what we're doing is we're taking the field, we're breaking it into temporary sections. We're going to start the animals at strip 1. They're going to move towards strip 2, and we're just going to keep giving them a little bit more space. In this instance, we have the water source towards the front, so they're going to continuously move towards that water source, and that's going to keep them away from the areas that they've already grazed. Normally, the way things have worked on my farm is we've had the water station at the start and then moved them along. And when they get to that 5-day point, then we move the water station ahead of them and put a chaser wire behind them to do that same idea of keeping them off that fresh regrowth. Now, mob grazing, this is something it's strip grazing at an extreme level. It's high density grazing. Ideally, you want to do multiple moves per day. It's fantastic for manure application. And when I talk about high density grazing, I'm not kidding. You can see numbers as high as 200 and 300 head per acre in that duration. So you are moving a lot of animals in a very small area. What they're going to do is they're going to beat up that ground. They're going to knock over a lot of grass, and they're going to deposit a lot of manure. You're going to get really good coverage over that area, but you got to keep them moving. Now, normally we're going to have a few different combinations. This is actually mostly my pasture broke out as it is. So that bright green is some of the grazing areas, and you can see that there's a little bit of overlap here. That's just because of how we had to do it to make things show up. This piece here actually goes over to this corner, and then where that video was is here going into this section over here. Now what we'll actually do is we started off, we had this broke into sections. So we had a section probably about in line with the ATCO crane node on GMAPs. And then we had another one down here. Oh, I'm sorry. I see the pointer and you don't. I do apologize. So I will keep this in mind. Thank you. Okay, if we look at the pictures here, the oddly shaped picture on the far right actually fits in below that piece that sticks out to the left. Where we had the video going, where the cows were crossing into the new strip, that's in that big white spot in the middle of the L shape. So hopefully that kind of helps visualize what we're looking at. And the bush lot is at the bottom to the right. Now what we ended up doing, you'll notice there's a bit of a narrowing on the strip that runs up and down on the extreme left, that very long narrow strip. And we had that broken down into 3 sections. And so the animals would go into one of those sections, they'd eat it for a few days, and then move to the next section. Standard cell grazing. Sorry, we had 4 sections there. Now what we've done is we've taken out some of those intermittent fences, and we've made it essentially 2 big cells. What we do now is we still use those old water stations, and we're able to move those animals along using the strip grazing method from one section to the next. And when they get beyond the one water station far enough, we'll move the water station to the next hookup and put a chaser wire behind them so that they can't go back. And that's going to help improve the regrowth. This is giving us substantially more growth, and those fields that are in the white area that that we turn the cattle in, that kind of works as a combination of hay ground as well as the cows taking off second and sometimes third cut to give the pasture a little bit more time to recover. So that's giving us a longer period of regrowth. Ideally this summer, we're going to see a little bit more breaking down of that big section there that's going to be at the very bottom, the one that's kind of camped out on its own to the right. And because right now that is standard cell grazing. They go in there for about 5 days, and then we move them into the next cell. If we can break that down and start getting the cattle to do more strip grazing, that's going to help increase the productivity of that piece as well. Now, there's a few ways that we can extend the grazing season as well. First off, we can strip graze annuals. So we can do things like strip grazing corn if you're talking the end of the season. I've been doing strip grazing of sorghum Sudan grass as well. Big fan of it. It grows very nicely, and you can get a lot of feed out of that in a relatively short period of time. We can also do things like bale grazing. If you have a place that needs some repair, that's a great spot to do some bale grazing. When I started doing bale grazing, I really wasn't doing it right. I had the feeders out in the field because the feeders in the field were my way of keeping the waste down. I learned as I walked through my pasture and looked at what was going on that I wasn't wasting feed when I was leaving hay on the ground. Instead, I was building up soil. There's no such thing as waste when you're putting stuff on the ground. It's either going to feed the cattle or it's going to feed the ground. Either way, you're going to win. And so what we ended up seeing was when I took those feeders out, I was able to move the bales around a lot more. And because of that, we were starting to see some really nice, lush regrowth in areas where those bales were. So we started moving those bales around a lot more. We pulled out a whole bunch of hawthorns and we started doing some intensive bale grazing there near the end of the season. This is strip grazing annual corn. You can see the area that I've punched through with my trusty little four-wheeler. And basically we would break down an area. We'd run through it with the four-wheeler and then we'd set up our fence posts. The cattle would go to the fence, they'd stop, and we'd move them daily. We also kept some hay in there, some bales, and that helped to keep them from getting acidosis or any problems like that. I am so proud of this picture. You have no idea how proud I am of these two pictures here. This is bale grazing 101. If we look at the picture on the left, this was in the summer of 2020. We just pulled up about 5 acres of hawthorn trees. You can see the pile right there. And that was just what was growing underneath those trees. It really hadn't been able to take off. It had just been there kind of in a stagnant scenario. And what happened was the cattle were going in and eating what they could. You can also see where we put some bales out right there where the cows are kind of milling around in that drone shot. Now, if you look at that picture on the right-hand side, I know it's from a different perspective, but I can tell you from experience that I can walk through that section and there is that much grass all the way through. That's bale grazing right there. We've taken off the top. We've got rid of those hawthorns. They're that big pile right there, just waiting for me to have time and wet weather to burn. And the animals have gone through, beat up some hay bales, and helped feed that soil. That's given us a lot more feed. And the other thing that it's done is it's made that soil a lot nicer because we've added those bales. One thing we did not do was we did not go out and buy a whole bunch of seed to plant in there. The cows did the seeding themselves with the hay that they were eating. Let's talk about some of the tools. First off, I'm going to tell you, do not scrimp on your fencer. Anybody who goes out and looks to buy a fencer will see that it's rated for a certain amount of acreage. If you're doing rotational grazing, strip grazing, any sort of grazing, more intensive grazing, you want to have a fencer that's going to cover a lot more acres than what you have, because you're going to be running a lot more wire than just around the outside of that fence. The other thing that you want to do is get a fault finder tester. I've got the Gallagher one pictured here, but lots of other companies use them as well. It's not restrictive to Gallagher. The biggest thing that you want to do is get one. And the reason you want to get one is the old adage, time is money, is very true. If you have a fault finder, it's going to help you find that fault a lot faster than if you're using the grass method or a little short detector somewhere. And if you're like me, you can't even use the grass method because the fence is either on or it's off, and there doesn't seem to be anything in between. So get one of these. They are worth it. The first time you find one of those weak draws on your fence will pay off for the investments. A few more tools. Obviously, you want to use some fence posts of some sort. And if you're going to do multiple moves, you want to make sure that they're easy to stick in the ground or easy to move. There's a few options here. On the top left, we've got one that works really well, especially if you're doing something like sheep and you're going to have a multi-strand fence. That's one that you can use there. The top right is one that I use with my cattle quite often, and we refer to it as a pigtail post. What it is, it's got a single spot to put the wire. You're only going to use one wire, but you can get that wire set up and good to go in as little time as possible. Basically 2 to 3 steps across your pasture and you're done. If you're using a 4-wheeler or some other motorized vehicle, then it'll be even faster. If you're doing something like mob grazing, or you just don't feel like walking back and forth, picking up posts and putting them back down, and you don't have any sort of obstacles, you might want to look at wheels. These also act like fence posts. You string the wire through them, and what you can do is you move the one end of your wire to where you want to stop. Then you're going to go to the other end and just roll those posts over. When it's hooked up, the bottom 2 will be off. The other 4 will be on. The animals will know that they are live. If that being said, if you unhook it when you're moving it, that does make life a little bit easier for everybody. And then finally, the fence reel. These things are amazing. Again, Gallagher is not the only one. It's just one that I find a little bit easier to pull up online. My recommendation, if you're going to do some level of strip grazing, is to at least get 2. You want to have one in front of the animals, and you want to have one in front of the next section. That way you can always flip them over, one over the next. If you're going into a larger area where there's concern of the animals going backwards, then you'll want to get a 3rd one to act as a chaser wire and kind of keep pushing those animals along. For those of you that are sheep or goat producers, you might want to look at the electric netting instead of using the fence posts and the reels. They work really well as well. Just, before you start that there's going to be a draw on it because it's going to be going through a lot of grass. And if that's the case, get a bigger fencer again. So a few take homes, some things that I've learned. To me, keep the water close. If you don't have the water close, the cows are going to have to make a decision on really hot days if they want to eat or if they want to drink. And that gets to be a problem because your productivity is going to go down and the comfort of the animals is going to go down. Another thing that will happen if you have your water and your feed too far apart is those animals are going to be going to water If you have young stock with them, they're going to get tired in that gap between. They're going to lay down, and some coyotes are going to enjoy a nice meal. We don't need to give the coyotes any additional reason to eat our crop. So if we can keep the large animals with the small animals, that does help protect them. Personally, I recommend using different grazing season systems for different scenarios. If you have a pasture that's going to be a sacrifice pasture, great. There will be times when it will be called upon. And if that's the case, that's probably going to be closer to a cell grazing situation than a strip or a mob grazing scenario. If, on the other hand, you're trying to get over that field as quickly as possible to make sure that the feed doesn't go stagnant on you, that's when you're going to maybe use something like a strip grazing or a mob grazing mentality to move those animals along as quickly as possible. Or you can use your cells and just get them out of there as quickly as possible. Either way. Nature's a really efficient harvesting and fertilizing method. You've already bought the cows. During the growing season, why not let them do the harvesting and fertilizing for you? Same goes for sheep, goats, whatever. Again, I'm a beef farmer. That's where I'm going to go back to as my guide. And so as a result, if you can do this as best as possible, that's going to help cut down on your costs of production. And finally, there's no such thing as wasted feed if we're talking about a pasture. If the animals are trampling it, defecating on it, urinating on it, it's going to end up feeding that soil. And if they're eating it, it's going to feed the animals. Either way, it's not wasted. It's just, is it feeding the ground or is it feeding the animals? Both work. So with that, I'm going to, again, go back to this area that we bale grazed, and I'll open the floor for some questions.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, just a reminder for everybody, please feel free to stick your questions in the chat and I will pose them to Joe. So just right off the bat, we're talking about getting started with rotational grazing. Do you have any thoughts on how many paddocks someone needs to get started?
The reality is, anytime you're increasing the number of paddocks you have, you're going to be giving a bit of a rest period. So ideally more is better, but even if you go to, say, 4 paddocks a week at a time, that is something. That's going to be a nice rest period. Is it going to be enough over the course of the grazing season? Probably not, but is it going to be better than having just one big open area? 100%. Well, the biggest thing is more is better some way that you can.
Okay. And when you're starting to put up those cross fences, what are some things that you should think about when you're planning where to put those?
Normally what I like to do is I kind of like to keep an eye on the animals for a day or two and figure out how much space I need for the next grazing session. So if we're moving them every day, I want to make sure that they're not hungry by halfway through the day. If I'm only giving them enough feed for half a day, then I either have to move them more often or I have to make those areas bigger. Other things that you might want to keep in mind is obstacles. So we have a lot of hawthorns as seen in some of the photos. And as a result, we want to make sure that we don't have any pressure on those fences so that they can run straight as much as possible. If we're running those fences straight as much as possible, sometimes we're going to give a strip that's a little bit bigger than ideally we'd like to give, but that's because we're working around what we have. The other thing is trying to keep somewhat close to your water is also going to be a bit of a guideline as well.
And that's a great segue into our next question is how far is too far for water?
And I saw it pop up on the screen. I'll put it this way: if you're measuring the distance in kilometers, you're too far. We have done some walks in my pasture. My wife, when we first met, she'd been doing some marathoning and that sort of thing, and so we got an idea of how far our pasture is. If we're looking at a kilometer for feed to water, that is way too far. Personally, I'd like to keep it in that probably 200 to 400 meter max, but that's just me, and that's a little bit of how our system is set up. It's going to depend a little bit on where you are. It's going to depend on how much shade you have, and it's also going to depend a little bit on what your predator pressure is as well. And the other thing that you'll notice, going back to the mob drinking, is it's going to be very difficult to keep up to the cattle or sheep or whatever if you are building to feed a few animals at once. You just cannot get enough pressure to the animals to keep the water up, and your tank is going to be open or empty more often than full.
So Joe,
just to segue onto that, because I saw a quick question about hauling water.
Well,
in our
Joe,
case, oh, sorry.
Joe, I think before we get into that, just as you were transitioning your farm into a rotational system, what sorts of water systems did you end up using, and how did you decide those were the right fit for your operation?
So we're on a pipeline, or we're on a water line. So we just use the water line that was there. We know that we have pressure, which is fantastic. It's very simple to tap into. The only thing you want to make sure of is you want to make sure you don't have any leaks, because your water bill can get really high really fast. Another reason you want to keep the animals close, though, is because if they're dumping the water, then again, all that water is going out. Now at the back of the property, that's been a little bit more of a challenge, because it's a long way to run pipe, and we've been trying to figure out if we're going to move more water line back there, or if we're going to set up nose pump system out of the creek, or out of there's an old well in the back as well, and setting something up there. But we have to figure out something to make that back area work better.
Okay, so are you currently hauling water?
No, we
Okay.
don't even have a water wagon. We completely use the water line system.
Okay, and I see Jack Kyle weighed in the chat that he thinks the distance to avoid that herd instinct when cattle go back to water is about 250 meters. So Joe, it sounds like that your kind of 200 to 400 is minimizing that effect as much as possible on your farm. So this is another one of those how do you know where to start questions. About determining stocking rate. How do you know how many animals to put on a pasture? Or in your case, Joe, how did you decide how many animals to put on your pasture?
So in our case, we weren't fully using the land that we had, so we knew that we could add animals to it. We did have a little continuous grazing pasture nearby that we just said goodbye to this year, and there we were running our stocking density quite light because we were keeping it as a heifer pasture. But if we were doing a continuous grazing operation, or or that, we'd probably want to do, say, 1.5 acres per head for the grazing season. But again, that's going to depend on where you are. And it takes a lot of kind of watching your fields and seeing how they're growing back, seeing how quickly the animals are eating it, and making adjustments accordingly.
And I think the key point I heard in your answer was, it depends where in the province you are. So Joe's in Lambton County. He has very different growing conditions than some of you may have. So I will stick a link in the chat to goforages.ca. There's a page of pasture production, and on there is a carrying capacity calculator to help you get started estimating. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point depending on where you are in Ontario. So that's in the chat now as well. So Joe, we've had a couple of questions come in about bale grazing. So do you unroll bales now that you've moved away from feeders?
Actually, I don't. So I will just take the bale out, cut the string, and dump it on its side and let the cows do what they want with it. We don't have an unroller. If we had an unroller, we would definitely unroll it. But the one thing that I do like about using the full bale is then when the animals come back into the barn, they're used to gathering in that smaller area. And the other thing that I can do is if I see a problem area, say I'm seeing a lot of Canada thistle or a hawthorn trying to come back up, I can set the bale on that, and the animals working in that area is going to help beat up that soil a little bit and hopefully get rid of that weed before it becomes more of a problem.
Yeah, and I know it's very common to unroll bales on sheep operations, just more head, and you need the bunk space essentially. So
Right.
that is very common there.
Yeah.
When you're bale grazing, do you come back afterwards and spread out any of the hay the livestock didn't eat?
I haven't, and it's actually, in my case, you can see it maybe the year after, sometimes even a couple of years later, but within a very short period of time, those bale rings are going to disappear.
So you don't take a harrow or anything to it afterwards?
No.
Then? Okay.
No.
Are you bale grazing in the summer, or is that more of a winter feeding practice for you?
Actually, we bale graze in the summer.
Okay.
Normally here in Lambton County, we're going to have a drought period through early July. And normally we'll have a spot where we want to increase the organic matter. And in those areas, that's where we're going to kind of treat it as a sacrifice area. And we'll do the bale grazing there. The other time that we'll do it is at the end of the grazing series, or at the end of the grazing period. And the places that we have been doing it lately is where we've been removing the hawthorns.
Okay. So because you're feeding bales in the summer, does that affect how many bales you're putting out? Because the cows also have pasture. So like, are you feeding less than you would if you were bale grazing in the winter?
Yeah, definitely. Normally it's also a duration thing. The animals are going to be maybe bale grazing for a week or 2 weeks tops. We don't want to do that very long. We just want to give the pasture a little bit more time to recover if we don't have somewhere that we can put them. And it's just a case of watching the growth and seeing if we have a nice place that we can do that.
Okay. So kind of tying into that a bit is if you aren't bale grazing in a paddock at the time, you're just grazing normally.
Sure.
How low do you graze down to? Like, what's your target residual looking like before you move them?
So when I'm looking at mine, I ideally want to leave probably about half to a third of what was standing before. I'd like to see it over the tops of my boots at the very least when I'm going through. I want to make sure that there's something there, because that something is going to be both feeding the ground, and it's also going to give some surface area for photosynthesis to happen, and get that regrowth going.
Okay. And of course it's March and it's muddy March outside right now. So we've got another question about what's happening on your farm right now. So how are you managing mud? What was your wintering strategy when many of us are having a Lambton County kind of winter this year?
Yeah. So actually, because of the heavy clay that we have, because a lot of my pasture is low ground as well, and subject to flooding, we actually use a barnyard for the winter. If we had a really nice freeze, if I were to do it again, and I hope to do some more corn grazing this coming winter, I would do the corn grazing on frozen ground. But we didn't have frozen ground this year. And as a result, we ended up feeding some corn kernels to the soil, because the cows just weren't able to get them. They punched them through into the ground instead. Had that ground had a nice freeze to it, then that'd be a really nice spot to do that annual grazing or bale grazing if we had it.
So now that you're a few years into your rotational grazing journey, what's something that you wish you knew before you started dividing up your pasture?
Yeah, so I guess a few things that I wish I understood better. The importance of leaving residual. It's back to the presentation. There's no such thing as waste in the pasture. You're either feeding the cattle or you're feeding the ground. And as a result, sometimes we forget that if we're new to the idea. We want to see that grass cut down like it's cut by a lawnmower. And the downside to that is it's going to take longer to regrow, and you're actually taking nutrients out of the soil as it's trying to get going. So that's going to make some problems for you down the road. That's one that I've been incredibly grateful to have learned from. And I just kind of wish that I learned it a little bit sooner. The other thing is being willing to utilize multiple types of grazing. Personally, when I started, the cell grazing was the way that we did it. And I remember hearing guys talk about cell grazing, and they said, okay, well, the next thing you want to do is split your cells in half. And okay, there's a lot of wisdom to that, but you can go to the work of splitting your cells in half, or you can utilize a strip grazing system within those cells and make those areas a little bit bigger or smaller as you need to help achieve the same thing. The one other thing is being willing to use the poly wire instead of just straight wire when you're doing a strip grazing system, because the animals do pick up on it a lot better. And if they can see it, they know it's time to move or it's time to wait. And the first time I tried doing strip grazing, I just used standard wire. It was cheaper and it was there. I didn't strip graze for a number of years after. So that's one thing that I would definitely say is make sure the animals can see where you want them to go.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. So, thinking about the end of the grazing season, do you leave a certain amount of residual or of grass cover to go into winter? on your final grazing pass, is that something that you're thinking about? Are you planning for that or not so much?
Yeah, so normally we'll have a few different areas where we'll make sure that we leave a decent amount of cover. And then there might be a couple areas that we may be willing to sacrifice a little bit more so that we can keep the animals out of the barn as long as possible. And those might be some of the areas that we're going to do some of the bale grazing. Normally we're going to be doing our bale grazing in the fall time during the if we're doing the bale grazing in the fall, we want to do it on the high ground because our creek can jump 6 feet overnight. So we have to be very careful of that if a rainstorm comes in. So that's one thing that we want to do is we want to stay high as much as possible, just because in our situation, flooding is a real issue.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Joe. I'm going to turn things back over to Patricia so that she can give some final comments.
Thank you, Joe and Christine, for the questions and the presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you. Another great thank you to our conference sponsors, Beef Farmers of Ontario and Farmers for Climate Solutions Farm Resilience Mentorship Program, to tonight's speaker sponsor, Ontario Sheep Farmers, and to you for joining us. Good night, everyone.